Before I get too started, my name is Reid Gillette, and I wanted to share my story, how I ended up being a professional web developer, which I've been for the last year. Before we get too far along, just to get an idea of what kind of audience I have, how many people here are what I'll describe as junior developers? So people who aren't doing professionally? Good, good. Welcome, because I don't know if you, I was here 2 years ago and sort of felt like an interloper or that I was sneaking around among people who were supposed to be here. But I hope by now you've figured out that you are supposed to be here. This is where you're supposed to be. And good for you for being here. It's an important step. And just out of curiosity, where's the more senior people? Perhaps the people who are supervising? And a couple of them too. Good, good. Welcome everybody. So I started putting this together, and as I was thinking about all of the different things that I wanted to share, I realized there was a common thread between everything. Everything was coming back to the people that I met, the people that I was interacting with, the people that encouraged me. And so I wanted to introduce you to a couple of those people. The first one is Felix, and he, despite the photo, he's actually a real generous, nice guy. And I was friends with Felix before I wasn't doing any development. I was just happily designing retaining walls along highways, none the wiser. And after fiddling around with some PHP, because that's what I had fiddled with before, writing a web app, database-backed. It was kind of a nightmare. I didn't know frameworks. I didn't know anything, so I was basically writing this ORM by hand in PHP really horribly. And I happened to mention to him that I was doing this, and he said, "You've got to check out Ruby on Rails." I was like, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." So I got the Agile web development on Rails, like probably many people here potentially did, and started developing that. And as I did that, I had this resource in Felix. I could go and talk to him. Hey, I'm running into this problem. Hey, here's what the interaction that I'm trying to create. What do you think? And he was an amazing sounding board. Now we never paired. It was never that close. Honestly, I'm not even sure he's ever seen any code that I've actually written. But we did a lot of whiteboarding. We did a lot of discussing of technologies and things like that. And he encouraged me to come to Lone Star 2 years ago. And that was incredibly valuable. And then a year ago, he and I also went to RailsConf here in Austin. And that's when I met Andrew. Andrew is the vice president of Mavenlink. And met up with him, interviewed. We seemed to get along. He seemed to understand my passion for what I was doing. And talking and learned a lot about Mavenlink, about pairing, about their stack and what they could offer. And he said, in an informal conversation we had that later we picked up later, he kind of said, "Would you be interested in moving to San Francisco?" Well, I had come to RailsConf without any. I said I was going to look for a job, but I never actually thought I would look for a job. And all of a sudden somebody's saying, "Would you be interested in moving to San Francisco?" And I thought about it after a while, and I was like, "Yeah, actually I would be interested in moving to San Francisco." So accepted an offer, and it was about 3 weeks in between accepting the offer. I sold everything I owned and moved to San Francisco with 2 duffel bags moving into a hotel room that I had for 2 weeks. It was awfully intense. It was kind of crazy. I don't know if I could do it again, but it has turned out really great. And so working at Mavenlink, I met another person, and he wouldn't give me a picture, so he gets a grumpy cat picture. So Chris his background, he had been with Mavenlink for maybe 6 months or so by the time I joined. And Chris is not a web developer. He does web development now, but he wouldn't describe himself as a web developer. Doesn't really like web development, doesn't really like Ruby that much. He did some game programming and worked at Kaiser, just huge. The stories he tells me about working in a truly giant, faceless enterprise corporation are pretty amazing. But a lot of times, I think people would discard somebody like that, and because he doesn't like Ruby, he doesn't like Rails, and he's vocal about it. But I took that as an opportunity. That's still somebody that has been so informative to me in my progression as a developer, because suddenly I had somebody, because we all get here and rah, 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 and Ruby's great, and I like Ruby a whole lot. But it's interesting to hear somebody say, here's what I don't like about Ruby. Here are things that Ruby does that is weird. And because of that, I've learned some Python. And because he really likes Python. And so we'll go back and forth. And it's interesting it's nice having that resource of somebody that I can talk to and bounce ideas off of, and just because I like Ruby and he doesn't so much, he's a tremendous resource. So I would encourage you to not discount somebody who doesn't like Ruby. Just like we had the talk yesterday about Elixir. That was incredibly informative, and that changed the way, that will affect the way that you write Ruby, hopefully in a good way, even though it's functional. It'll change the way you're thinking about code. So it was these people, and a cat, but it was these people that were so important to to my progression and my leveling up as a developer. And it wasn't just these three people. There are a lot of people. I actually, we have a guy who's 19 years old. He graduated high school, married his high school girlfriend, and moved to San Francisco, just like I did. And he works there, and he's one of our best developers. And even though he's 10 years younger than me, I still, it's amazing what I can learn from him. And he's a great developer, actually. And so the takeaway is, the junior developers, you guys, are some over here and there's some back there. Find these people and surround yourself with them. And like Chris was for me, they may not be who you think they are. They're all around. I've got good news. By coming here, you found a lot of them. You found these types of people. These are who you want to be around. And for those senior developers, be this person. Be one of these people. And Felix was I would say, quote unquote, mentor. These other people, they didn't seek out to mentor me. They're not highly invested in what it is. They want to see me exceed. But the amount of interest that it took very little for them to encourage me. And that small amount of encouragement was worth volumes. So I'd encourage you, I hope everybody's involved in the Ruby user groups maybe around, or these conferences. You can make a whole lot of difference with very little effort, and I'd encourage you to try and do that wherever, because it can really help a junior developer. So Mavenlink, I chose Mavenlink for a couple of reasons. The thing that stood out to me is they did 100% pairing. Mavenlink bootstrapped their engineering, bootstrapped the app at Pivotal Labs. I'm sure many of you have heard about that. Pivotal pairs all the time. Pivotal's philosophy on pairing is on the spectrum from everybody solos and everybody is pairing all the time. Always everybody soloing has drawbacks. Everybody pairing has has drawbacks too. But more pairing is better than less pairing. And so rather than try and make that distinction, let's always pair. And that's greatly simplifying their philosophy. But and what I was encouraged when I was interviewing and talking to their engineers, which you should absolutely do when you're looking for a job, is talk to them and try and get a vibe of what they think about the company. Almost try and put them in your shoes and find out what they would say or what questions they would ask. And I asked them about pairing. What do you think about pairing? How does that work? How do you think that has helped the company? And what I heard from several people is we pair all the time. It's not the silver bullet. It doesn't solve every problem, but that's what we do. And hearing that realization of, hey, we know that this isn't always the best thing, but it's what we do, that to me told me that it wasn't dogma. Pairing there wasn't dogma. And that told me that a lot of things weren't dogma. They were interested in being flexible, in moving around, being willing to change things that weren't working. It wasn't just we're going to continue trying to do that. And that was comforting. The code base at Maven Link, when I joined, they had just upgraded to Rails 3.2. This is an app that started pre-Rails 2.3. And a lot of engineering effort went into keeping that up. And it made me feel comfortable because as a junior developer, I had not really used Rails 2.3 or earlier. And so I felt comfortable that I could go in and read the code and contribute immediately. I wouldn't have this huge learning curve, and that was important to me. And the dev stack was very similar to what I was using. We used RubyMine, which is something I hadn't used, but generally MySQL, that kind of things. It's pretty typical Rails stack, but it was important to me to feel comfortable because much like I said at my first Lone Star, that I felt like an interloper. I kind of felt like I had tricked them into hiring me. And I know that's not the case now. And I think that was critical. When I interviewed, I almost tried to not let them hire me. I was very upfront and very vocal of, here's what I don't know. Here are things that maybe I'd like to look into, but I can't because I'm just doing this in my living room. Here are gaps in my skills that I know. And by telling them that, I then felt confident that they hired me knowing that. I didn't trick them into doing that. And that also let them know, hey, he knows about these things. That means he's going to try and correct these, or not correct, but fill this in. That was a show of passion of me, and it allowed a focus on those things. I didn't do a whole lot of JavaScript. I pretty much began 2013. I had my 6-month performance review, and they asked, what do you want to work on? I said, well, I still don't feel super confident in JavaScript. Can I do more of that? And they said, sure. And so most of the last 6 months, I've been doing Backbone. And it's really helped. And it's nice to have a company that will let me do that. They know, hey, you're not as strong here. You want to be strong. Let's put you in that position so that you can succeed. And it's through people like Chris who have helped me learn that, because I can ask him these questions and I get both the good and the bad. I'll talk a little bit more about pairing, because pairing has been absolutely critical in bringing me up. We actually we have a fairly junior team, and I don't know, is Alec in here? I don't see you. Oh, he's back there. Alec is also from Maven Link, and he was also hired as a junior developer, and it's very good for training people. I don't have the junior people had much exposure to pairing? Some. So there's kind of two ways that we would end up pairing. And sometimes it would be junior-junior. And that's not necessarily, junior-junior was good, putting two junior people together was good for certain bug fixes, certain things like that. But it sort of becomes blind leading the blind to a certain extent. What was best, I felt, was pairing a junior person with a senior person. And this has a big downside, which is you can fatigue the senior person in that pair pretty easily. It works well to match strengths with weaknesses. For example, Chris doesn't know Rails as well, or didn't when I started. But I actually, even though he was a much better developer than I was, I knew more Rails than he did. And that worked really well between us because he knew the code base, he knew better what techniques he wanted to use, but I knew how to get it done in Rails. And so he'd go put something in there. It's like, oh, we can just use pluck in this case. And that was also very supportive to me because, once again, it gave me the opportunity to feel like I was contributing. Like, hey, this guy has way more experience. I'm the junior in this pair, but I can help him learn. He can help me learn. More recently, we did a project where it was sort of, we call it extreme pairing, kind of with a wink, because it's really more two people working on separate things next to each other. It's not soloing what we did on this project. It was, I was regularly conversing with him. He was regularly conversing with me, both on what he was working on and what I was working on. There was still a shared context. It just wasn't two people at the same computer. And it worked out really well in that case, front end versus back end. He was doing something in Backbone, I'm doing something in Rails and Ruby, and he'd say, hey, I need this data, like give me an endpoint. Like, cool, I'll bust that out and create a controller action, or add a method, or output that in the JSON, or whatever he needed, and that provided that interface. In a lot of ways, our pairing, our coding mimicked how our respective software was going to be interacting. I think that worked more for me now after working there for a year as less of a junior. He's still much more senior than I am, but I think that is a very valuable tool. And ping pong pairing, which I don't know if people are familiar with, that's where one person would write the spec, the other person would write the implementation. And that's if you're doing it correctly. Sometimes it turns into one person writes the implementation, the other person writes the spec. But that works out really well, and can be good because the senior person can set up the junior person. And you're writing you have specs. So you know, here's what it needs to do. And a lot of times, the specs are going to give away what the actual code needs to look like. And it can become a tutorial where the senior person can go and put in their spec and then go pong, and now the junior person has to sit there and drive, which is critical for these junior-senior pairs. So, tips, if you're pairing as a junior, and especially I'm thinking about the first month that I was there, where I've never seen this code base. The amount that I can contribute, I felt was very, very little. It wasn't, but it was hard for me to get used to. I'm coming to work, I'm I'm claiming to be a web developer, but I barely touch this computer. It's a very strange feeling at first. And there are ways you can do that. You should be following along intently. See what they're doing, and you want to look at the style, because the style that you learned, the style that you may be more comfortable with, while that's perfectly acceptable, you want to match the style of the code base. I was working on my own little project for the previous place I worked for, and I had a certain style, a certain testing style as well. And now I was in this giant code base. It's my responsibility, it's my job to match that style. You can tweak, and I'm not as good about it as possible. I'm a big fan of explicit returns and things like that, which I don't see in our code base very much. I just gotta no head shake, but it's important to do that, because you'll find eventually those lines of code, even if it's in the style that you like, they will stick out like a sore thumb as you're scrolling through. You're like, who wrote this method? Or I've before gone, who wrote this method? This doesn't look anything like the rest of this code base. And I'll go over, and I know I shouldn't, but I git blame it. And sure enough, there it says Gillette right next to it. And I'm like, ah. And sometimes I rewrite, and sometimes I don't. This was also something that I gained a lot from watching the senior people do it, because there would kind of be, on a particularly hard problem, they'd implement it in their own style, get the specs to pass, and then refactor it into the quote-unquote Mavenlink style. You should also be asking questions. And as a junior developer, it is your responsibility to ask questions if you don't understand. Like I said, I tried to tell them, here's what I don't know. And I couched it in, here's what I'd still like to learn. But effectively, I was telling them, here's what I don't know. And you should be asking questions. And if it's a company that has a pairing culture, you'll be expected to ask questions. And you should do that. Don't hesitate to interrupt. And if they may be in the middle of a thought, they'll finish that thought and come back. That's kind of the pairing contract. And you should also try and drive, which actually operating the keyboard. It will feel intimidating. It will feel slower, especially early on. But I think Katrina was saying you have to practice, and this is how you will get better. And I was not particularly good at driving. I would follow along. I would be engaged, but this guy can type faster than me. He's much better at operating the IDE and all of this. So I'll just let him do it. And I'd still work with him, but do it. I was severely holding myself back. And the last 6 months especially, I've been trying to be aggressive at the keyboard. And that has really helped. So I would encourage you, do not feel intimidated. You will be rewarded handsomely for taking that initiative and grabbing that keyboard whenever possible. There is I will put an asterisk there. You do have to get a feel for the pair. There is a give and take. But if you're a senior developer working with a junior developer, there's some things that you can do. You should explain the why of a solution if they don't seem to be following. An example would be we use for matching, determining, if two objects belong, if one object is maybe the like primary contract on an account or something like that. You could just say .account equals @account, or .contract equals @contract. You could absolutely do that. What we do, and it's the style, is use .contract_ID equals contract.id, because that saves you potentially saves you another database lookup. And you're still comparing IDs. You're still doing the same comparison. And that's a very basic explanation. But explaining that may not be readily apparent to a junior developer sitting next to you. So explain why you're doing that, because I'm sure they're smart. They'll know that works, but it may not be readily apparent why you're doing that over some other solution. And try and let the junior drive. Try and encourage them to drive. Ping pong pairing is one great way to do that, because you pong and take your keys off the keyboard. You make a big show of it, like I was doing. That's kind of the joke that we do. Side note, we typically do that as somebody will be doing some terrible implementation and get to a part in the problem that they can no longer figure out, and they'll just kind of go, okay, pong, as though they've got it figured out, and now it's time for the other person to just implement the test, when really they didn't figure it out. But it's also good to show your style versus the company style. That has helped me a lot in seeing it may be your style may be clearer to you. Your style could be clearer to the junior pair as well. And if you're test driving, red green refactor, get it working and refactor it into something that the code base is going to be. That can help them see the solution in a different way. I've done that before with say an implementation of using inject versus some weird select map thing, where they may be used to, there may be a better understanding of how select and map or reject or one of those enumerable things work, but they may be less comfortable with inject. And it becomes a really good tool because you can implement it in a way that maybe is clearer or is clear in one context. You have the specs, you know the specs pass, then you can demonstrate, here's how inject works. Here's how this series of methods works with inject. And you had your red, your green, and then you can refactor, and the specs stay green. It's a good reinforcement of it. And I talked a little bit about our extreme pairing. We've done a little bit of soloing since I've been there. This kind of grew out of my own, or how I started doing some soloing at work was my own interest. And it was good on Maven Link. Andrew, who I introduced, one weekend for the heck of it, I was playing around with EC2 and set up a Minecraft server on EC2. I had no intention of actually running a Minecraft server. I just wanted to play with EC2. That seemed like something that would be fun to play around with. And so in talking to Andrew, it was like, oh, what do you do this weekend? Oh, well, I set up Minecraft server on EC2. He said, oh, are you interested in that? Would you like to keep doing that? Here's the company's Amazon credentials. Why don't you, no, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. Why don't you play around with our CI server? And because we were using Jenkins at the time. And he's like, we don't really like how the CI server is. Why don't you log on, see what you can do with it? And so over 2-3 months, I rebuilt our CI server, mostly in my own time. But now I really know how that all works, all of that struggle. And if if you get an opportunity, here's a pro tip for junior developers. If you get an opportunity to set up a continuous integration server, don't. It's a bag of hurt. We've since moved to Travis. Travis is kind of its own bag of hurt, and completely separate problems. But now it's somebody else. You get soloing even on certain things. Over the Christmas break, nobody came into the office, and those that weren't taking vacation soloed. And the feature that I worked on, I feel incredible ownership. I feel more ownership from that thing that I did 6 months ago than the thing I did two months ago. And I couldn't wait, as soon as we get back from Christmas, I couldn't wait to get that thing that I worked on over Christmas into the code base, because that was mine. And there were very few things that I felt were mine. And that's a downside of pairing. You do lose that sense of ownership. And you're not alone as you're doing this. It's soloing, but we're on hip chat. We're sitting next to a person. They're there to ask questions. I ask questions about side projects that I'm working on. I was doing Ember. I'm the only person in our office who has experience in Ember, but that's even been valuable to ask them, how would you troubleshoot this? And inevitably they're like, oh, put a console log. I was like, well, that's not going to work in Ember because there's a run loop. Anyway, I digress. There's still advice and questions, and you can learn a lot from having to ask questions too. It's very easy to ramble in your solution, and having to get that question, having to ask somebody who doesn't know anything about the problem you're trying to solve, it's a skill to be able to boil that down to 3 sentences that tells them that helps them answer the question. And one last thing, I'm almost out of time here. Hiring a junior dev, you want to see, I notice the not just looking for a paycheck, which isn't to say not looking for an actual job. In San Francisco especially, I'm not sure what it's like in Austin. There's programs that train up devs, and I think those are very good. In San Francisco, especially, there seems to be, because of the startup culture, there's a lot of people who are involved in startups, but not the engineering side. They're in the business side, and there have been people who were doing that and went, hey, this startup stuff's kind of fun. Oh, those engineers over there, they make a lot more money than me, and it looks like they're having a great time and aren't working very hard, and I'll go do that. And they don't have the passion and drive that I think is really valuable, and don't have a desire to learn. They got hired, they're done. For the junior developers here, you are not those people by the very nature that you're here. And so looking for that drive, looking for that desire to learn will get you the absolute best junior developers that you can find. And they are out there, and it worked out really well. I was hired as junior. I like to believe that I contribute a lot to Mavenlink. Mavenlink has contributed a lot to me, and I'm very grateful to that. And also to this community that was a foundation that I was able to stand on in order to achieve that. I think that's all the time I have. Please come talk to me. I very much would like to talk to anybody, but especially the junior devs, because I know it can be intimidating.
So the question is when Maven Link is pairing.
Thank you.